Something unprecedented happened to me yesterday when I left Michigan to fly out to Boston. That was for the first time in my life I left home without a pen. Not a single pen. This backpack, which I've had since actually we were students, is always full of 3 pens, but I had taken them out for a reason that I won't bother explaining, and forgot to replace them, even though I looked and said, there's no pens in there, before I left. And so I've been without a pen for 2 days. Apparently nobody has pens anymore. So I went and asked somebody to the set, do you have a pen? Okay, well, you know what? It's too late. Here's why it's too late. Because normally I will write out the poems I'm going to read beforehand, and then we'll just follow that program. But I had no pen. And that's a serious impediment to the writing of anything. So I'm going to be sort of making things up as we go along just a little bit. And I'm going to start with 2 poems. The first one is really a proem, if you know that word. It's the introduction to the whole volume of St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. So I'll just start with that one because I think it really captures, as it was intended to do, the theme of this, which is my 4th book of poems. To an unborn child. Storm clouds move in and darken all the house. The morning paper on the kitchen table dim, where I've been reading some reporters grouse at things already bad, now growing grim. Most of the prodigies agree with him. I rise to light a lamp and hear the thunder and watch the first drops thudding on the lawn. Your mother joins me. Here we stand in wonder, between the hour that marks your life's first dawn and that one, still obscure, we're counting on. Now, I told Patrick I had something to say about him, and it was not intended to be the tailgating reference. That one came out spontaneously before I could shut myself up. It was this. The title of this book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, comes from the title poem, which is naturally of the same name. And I used to pursue, I need to get back to this actually, the practice of Flannery O'Connor of reading a little bit of the Summa every day. She would do it before bed. I used to do it in the morning, right after prayer. And when I got into the treatise on law, as Aquinas is talking about the Mosaic law, there is a long article that explains why each of the birds whose consumption is forbidden by the Mosaic law is so forbidden. And it was ingenious. Aquinas talking about seagulls and ibises and ospreys and hoopoes. And I just thought, this is one of the most poetic things I've ever encountered, contradicting Drew Rosado's claim when I first met him that there was nothing poetic about Thomas Aquinas, which I thought was, I'm sure he doesn't hold that view now, but but I remember him saying that when I first met him. It was just incredible, and I thought, if there was ever a text of Thomas Aquinas that begged to be set into heroic couplets, this is it. So I simply copied out his article and then just began making couplets for each of the birds without any intention of writing a poem. I just wanted to hear what it would sound like to get Thomas Aquinas's arguments in rhyme and meter, in specifically the couplet. But before I had finished, I could see the old saint reciting. And one of the reasons I could envision him composing before his amanuenses is because I had stopped in to visit Patrick when he was still a graduate student at Notre Dame after I had moved away, and I came and he had this huge blow-up paleography of Thomas Aquinas' shorthand. And I learned that day a lot about the composition of the Summa Theologiae. So I came well prepared to envision what might have happened. And so as I saw him reciting St. Thomas, I thought, no, this is not just some nice little lines about birds. This is a poem. St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Beyond the window, morning sparrows made their song, as if the whole world's goodness paid its plenty out for them and them alone. The old saint heard their joy and squelched a moan, as his legs, stiff and heavy still with sleep, arranged themselves beneath his cassocked heap of belly. Where had he left off before? He asked his three amanuenses, more for their sakes, sprightly fingers, sluggish minds, than his. One said, with the forbidden kinds of birds, and what their figures signified for Moses, who charged the eagle's flight with pride. Aquinas sat a moment, mind withdrawn from his mouth's taste of buttered loaves, the dawn without, the wish for more wood in the fire, to clear the frost from stone, or to admire the cool, swift brilliance of all he said, as a swan plumes its white and well-turned head. He spoke. The long-beaked ibis feeds on snakes, to represent the man whom nothing slakes. Feasting upon dead bodies' opened gore, the vulture stands for all who thrive through war. When Noah let the raven out to fly, it never did return, to signify such men whose souls are blackened by foul lust, or who unkind won't pay back trust with trust. The plodding puffball ostrich is that which figures all those weighed down with growing rich, and hearing God's call plant their soiled head. Plovers, like gossips, on stray words are fed. And who, on seeing the gull, does not admire that its bright wings to heaven may aspire, and yet it wastes its hours adrift at sea, gorging on fishy sensuality. The hoopoe builds its nest on heaps of dung, just as despair's eyes view the world all wrong. He paused then at the thought of earthly sorrows, our sickly pasts, incarnadine tomorrows, the myriad things that whistle arcane truth, to please old minds and to instruct raw youth, and bore down on his broken knees to pray for such a world that had so much to say. So that poem, as soon as I wrote it, I said, this is the title poem of my next book, although it in fact was the title book of two books on. I won't go into details on that one, but this book was delayed in the writing, you might say. And it was because I just sensed that these are the great themes that I wanted to work on in this book. The encounter with the incarnadine tomorrows, the brutality of modern history, but also that same broken world is a world of, as Dante would put it, polysemy, the polysemus, the depth and multiplying meanings of things. One of the great joys in reading those that article from Aquinas on the forbidden birds was that it clearly refuted a claim I had heard, I don't even remember when, but at some point during graduate school, when someone said that the traditional spiritual interpretations, the typological interpretations of theology of the Christian fathers, for instance, had no place in the scholasticism of Aquinas. And I thought, here it is. You just have to read past page 5. It's amazing. It's so great. I mean, among other things, because it's not only Aquinas doing profound theology, but you can feel scholasticism touching that other great medieval achievement, the medieval bestiary, all the lore about lions and elephants. So I thought this is what I wanted to order the theme of my book. The density of being and the richness of its significance, but also the horrors of things. So, being inclined into the melancholy side myself, I thought I'd read one of the poems that makes a sort of statement about the brutality of things. And it's called, I was going to do one, but I'm going to change my mind because you're a student who drove me here today was telling me that you all read a fair amount of Plutarch. And you read, I presume, I can't remember, is Cicero included? Life of Cicero? Okay. No? Okay. Some people think that they've read the Life of Cicero and some of you don't. I'm going to wait, I'd encourage you to discuss that tomorrow after this reading is over. But for those of you who have read Plutarch's Life of Cicero, here is a poem that captures what you might say is the final moment, the death of Cicero. The death of Cicero. A fluttering of wings and sudden pain entered the guarded portals of his head, beneath its sheet, and woke him once again to find a ring of crows about his bed. The sunlight shimmered on the distant sea. The birds cawed, restless, as though one divine had sent their feathered darkness as a sign that death approached and he must rise and flee. His servants pulled him through the postern gate to ride in shadows to a waiting ship, as if provision could slip free of fate. The litter jostled, sweat curled on his lip, and dust plumes rising at the hastening feet settled upon his robe and graying beard. His valet's eyes were wild with what they feared and found the blazing sails of Antony's fleet. The carriage veered, then rattled to a halt. Its drape swung open to reveal two men. They stood with swords drawn, ready for assault. He offered none, stretched forth his neck, and when the blade was raised, told them do what they would. His head dropped with his two hands in the dust. Then brought to Rome to answer Antony's lust, all three were nailed where Cicero once had stood. But this, historians note, was not the end. Antony's wife would bow before that head, and with her hairpin pierce its tongue to send one final message to the noble dead. Though they may speak with justice all their lives and bear death bravely, chatting of the soul, power shall rule the world from pole to pole, and nothing that defies its will survives. When I started working on that poem, I had conceived of it years before. In fact, around the same time I wrote St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, and I said, I've got to put off writing this poem until I've really gotten to live with Cicero's philosophy for a long time. So I spent months reading through, well, not months, but weeks anyhow, reading through Cicero and sort of making up for some of the patchiness of my own education, getting the Tusculan dialogues read, and etc. So then I write the poem that's twice as long as the one that you just heard. And I think something's not right, but it feels pretty good to me, and it was hard to write, so I hope I don't have to change it. And I sent it to this other poet, Dana Gioia, who's sort of a mentor of mine, and he said, "What are you trying to do? Sound like G.K. Chesterton at Lepanto?" I said, "No, that is definitely not what I was trying to do." So I cut out 5 stanzas and then wrote that final one that you just heard and added it back in. I sent it to him. I said, "What about now?" He said, "That's better." So there are 4 stanzas that go into all this detail about Cicero's life, what he thought about things, and they're all just on the cutting room floor forever. I mention only to say that the spirit of sacrifice and self-denial is important for writing. Let me give you another poem from an early section of this book. This book has 3 sections of 16 poems each, and I tried to sort of create this sort of mosaic movement through the book where themes will arise and disappear, poetic forms will arise and then disappear for a while, then come back. And so in each section, there's a kind of narrative travel poem. In the last section, one called Australia, which is about a country called Australia, of which you may have heard. Similarly, the longest poem of the book is actually a short story in blank verse called The Great State of Alaska. No explanation needed. And then third one, or really the first one to appear in the book is also, they're all in blank verse, actually, all in iambic pentameter blank verse. But this one is called the Fishing Camp, which is kind of a Michigan poem, even though it's really set in Canada. The Fishing Camp. When the 3 men returned to the old camp, after an absence of some 30 years, they found much as they left it, and remembered the boats lined up and beached upon the sand, a table perched above, its shape rough-hewn, and fish scales smeared into the weathered wood. The clearing, ringed with pines and papered birches, was much the same, save that a new-built cabin stood near the shore, its posts of varnished cedar cut from the island's woods. A far cry, that, from the cramped pile of gray and mortared logs where he had toughed out nights in childhood. That afternoon they sat out with their rods, sun flashing on the waves, and pulled the northerns out from the weedy shallows where they hid. Freed from its tri-barbed lure, a walleye flopped about the metal belly of the boat. But now it was his hand that had to pin it down and push the stringer through the jaws. His hand that slit the sides that night and ran a blade between the ribs and bright fillet. He sat for hours, casting in the silence. What came to him was sometimes very old. One afternoon, out trolling near the shore, between the pines, he caught sight of the cabin where they had stayed on their first visits there, a slope of bleached gray shingles lost in treetops. At dusk, they ate what they had caught, played euchre, or stood out by the fire pit drinking rye, tossed fish heads smoldering among the logs. Up early one day, while the others slept, he dressed and grabbed a hacksaw off its nail, then hunted for a trailhead in the woods, remnant from years before, one he had followed when as a boy with uncle, fathers, brothers, they dragged their weight up from the boats at dark to sleep on plank bunks nailed to the back wall. The loons would call and then recall each other with their great moans across the shrouded water, and other sounds much nearer and more troubling came to him, wakeful, limbs clenched still with fear, as mice crept in through spaces in the logs and ran along the creases of the cupboards, until they set a baited spring off snapping. He cut away the underbrush and found the trail as it rose up the hill and through the thick young woods, a trunk already fallen across it, dead limbs shagged with graying moss. He came at last to where the door had been, an empty mouth of shadow now, and entered. The floorboards bowed beneath his step. He saw the back wall haunted still by bunk frames, planks dusted with leaves, and cook stove scabbed with rust, its pipe detached and sagging toward the darkness. And so he stood in that familiar place, and knew he had arrived. But what it was that he was looking for he did not know, and did not think that he could ever say, but waited for it there, within its walls. That kind of experience I've always thought about. I remember as an undergraduate returning home on breaks from college and wandering through our house, looking for something that I couldn't name or find. I have all kinds of theories about what it is, but when I was writing this poem, it reminded me of Augustine in the Confessions, finally getting tired of relating the exterior events of his life that are recorded in his memory and turning inward into the memory itself to ask what it was. But then also, and I was moved to write this just because you mentioned Sweet Land of Michigan. Once we moved back to Michigan after our 13 years away, I thought, oh, that's what this poem was really about. Was there is a place in this world where you feel most at home, or at least most of us have such a place. And when you get there, you know that that's where you want to stay. So every time my university asks, so if we give you another endowed chair, would you move to Texas? I just glower. Let's see, how are we doing on time? So, yes. Okay, so another thing that came up on the car ride here, I had quite a car ride here this afternoon for discussion, was the different qualities of vagrants nowadays as opposed to in the old days. You just don't see drunk vagrants anymore. They're usually frozen with some sort of opioid drug addled, paralysis, which of course is very hard to see. And it reminded me of an encounter that was actually a true story originally, but this poem is totally made up. It just derives ever so faintly from reality. A wedding night. It's a little sonnet. The blaring horns and drumbeat slipped away as the great gilded door shut on the hall, and in my new wife's step and body all those fading rhythms lingered and held sway. The hour late, the moon lit up our way, of worn-out cobblestones and granite wall, of littered cup and dark graffiti scrawl, all still and tranquil, far removed from day. But had we thought this hour a lasting peace, the city's vastness our joy's privacy, a vagrant in a torn and soiled fleece, hunched in an alcove, rocking, one red eye roving through darkness till it fell on me, growled low and vacant, you too will die. In the true version of that, the kids thought that he was really threatening me. But it's like, no, he's not even aware I'm here. He's just looking into space. One more short poem from right there on a similarly grim subject. This book has, in each section, each of the sections has one very short poem in this shortened kind of meter and tercet form that I was trying to see if it would work. I didn't think it worked, but somebody who reviewed this book said they were the best poems in the book, maybe because they were the shortest. And each of them has light in the title: Twilight, Sunlight, but I thought I'd read you First Light. Why must I be the first one out each morning, houses sunk in fog and locked along my lonely route? The one whose unsuspecting face will catch the threads that spiders draped across their darkened hunting place, who finds the oily feathered crow with stiff claws upward just before it bloats with flies, I'll never know. It's so conventional to prize wakeful attention. We've grown blind to how it wounds our naked eyes. Okay, let me see if I can take us away from the land of bloated crows for a little while, or maybe for the remainder of our life. Yeah. So, yes. Patrick, Mr. Gardner, mentioned that this book was published by Word on Fire, and over the last few years, I've been asked by Word on Fire to be commissioned by them to compose different poems. And what was a particular thrill was there was a special issue of their magazine in celebration of Bishop Barron, and so I was asked to write 2 poems on the theme of somehow celebrating Bishop Barron. And I thought, poor Bishop Barron will probably have no idea what either of my poems have to do with him, but I thought they were right on the mark. So this is a poem called Remember, and it mentions midway through the Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay. Have any of you ever heard of him? So Claude McKay was a Jamaican-born and at one point Marxist, communist, etc. But he came to New York and he discovered, first of all, the excitement of life in Harlem in the early 20th century. And he also discovered Shakespeare. And those were the 2 loves of his life. Unfortunately, because he was a Red, unfortunately for him, maybe not for the fate of the country, when he went abroad for a tour to visit, among other things, the Soviet Union and be paraded along as a fellow traveler, he was not readmitted to the country again afterwards, but at least not for a couple decades. Eventually, however, he converted to the Catholic faith and became a close confidant of Dorothy Day, and he published his last poems in the Catholic Worker newspaper, including a gorgeous poem. It's actually an early poem from his communist days that became a Catholic poem despite himself, that's about a Russian church. Most of his poems are sonnets. He just loves Shakespeare's sonnets. So you'll have to look that one up. But that's referred to here as is another poem of his called Tropics in New York, where he is on a New York City street, but reminded of his Jamaican childhood. Again, what that has to do with Bishop Barron, I guess only I know probably at this point. Okay, it's a poem called Remember. We laugh to hear some crank philosopher once taught that learning is remembering, and what the soul knows now it knew before. but buried with its birth, as if life were a gradual return to everything precious and splendid that our minds adore. Yes, we know better, don't we? That the curse of time runs like a cataract downhill, a surge of force that batters all to nothing. The bad is carried blindly to the worse. The dancer's lively bones will soon lie still. The spring itself at last will cease its frothing. But then I recollect my mother's face, she born among the rail yards and skyscrapers, but having left them all long since behind, grew luminous when someone from that place gave her a bundled stack of old newspapers and brought the absent city back to mind. Or picture, in some noisy Harlem street, the eyes of Claude McKay spy ginger root and tangerines piled on a grocer's cart. At once his heart flies from the city's beat, borne back to native boughs weighed down with fruit, and prayers abandoned in pursuit of art. He would, years on, seeking the paradise the Russian Revolution brought to being, find himself drawn instead within a church and bowed before the altar's sacrifice. That body of the dead man he'd been fleeing, as if it were the object of his search. And so it probably was. For what we seek we cannot really know, or it would be already ours. We trust in our desire, not just to bear us through another week, but as eyes wait for light's return to see, and cold hands open on remembered fire. Did anybody notice the reference to Plato in there? not the subtlest literary allusion of all time. Let me give you a couple more. So here's one. It's about my son, James Augustine. And naturally, it's called James's Book. One night, my oldest son comes on a quest to ask if he can write a book. Of course, I say. What kind of story should it be? He does not know, but soon, as from some source flowing within the soil's depths, we see a boy at the front door, a shadowy guest. A trembling hand extends a folded note, which late that night the boy will read in fear. Days pass, he loads a pack with what he needs, till in the dark his footsteps frighten deer away and bring him to a place of weeds and stones in the old forest. This we wrote. And we wrote next his searching through the waste, the flashlight burning blue on logs and moss, as he brushed back thick leaves to look beneath, then his caked fingers felt the iron cross, jagged with rust and chill. He clenched his teeth and dug the clay in which it was encased. At last, then, in the insect thrumming dark, he gripped it firm and twisted while he pressed, just as the note instructs. An ancient gear, somewhere below, disturbed from its long rest, begins to shift. The cross springs up, and here opens the door its buried heft would mark. What now? I asked. He waits for me, unsure. Dust rises on cold air from down below, but his light cannot reach what lingers there. He must descend beneath its circle glow, on a rough braided rope to find out where the passage leads and what it holds in store. That's all we've got. I tell him we'll need art to fill out all the pages of our book. I'll do it. I can draw the cross, he says. And you can see from his warm, wavering look that just to make the shape in crayon is all he dares try. But he can't wait to start. In the last section of the book, a lot of the poems are on the theme of that possibility of making things. Has a poem about Dante, not several poems about Dante in the book. Poem about the great Michigan writer Russell Kirk, if you've ever heard of him. But I thought I'd share this one with you. Has anybody heard of Jacob of Sarug? Good. it. I mentioned reading the Summa after prayers in the morning at the beginning of this reading, and sometimes, usually I pray with the Magnificat reader, and many of you who know that little magazine will know that after the prayer there will always be some kind of little excerpt from either a text of the fathers or something along those lines. And so on this particular morning, I finished my prayers and I looked, and there was I think a Feast of Visitation, perhaps. I don't remember exactly when it was. And there was an excerpt from this fellow Jacob of Sarug, and I thought, boy, this is really poetic. This is nice. This should be a poem. I should maybe just put some of these lines in verse and see how it sounds, kind of the way that the St. Thomas poem started. So I did, and then subsequently learned that Jacob of Sarug was one of the church fathers who, like Ephraim the Syrian, who wrote all of his theology in verse. And so it had been a poem. It reminded me of the old Saturday Night Live sketch where a lounge singer says, "We translated this song into French and then back into English." So this was originally effectively a poem by Jacob of Sarug, but since I didn't at the time know that it had been a poem, I took liberties with it. I really used it just as inspiration. Some of it's his, some of it's mine. Elizabeth to her cousin. Blessed are you, O maiden. Bless the fruit which dwells within your womb, beloved in that holy rest whose secret comes to sacred bloom. And blessed is this virgin birth, which shall uproot sin from the earth. Who grants this favor to me now, that you should come, O blessed one, bearing the great who is made low? By his own will this thing is done, the mother of a king, and yet it's by my wooden door we've met. Let every mouth speak out your praise, and all the seraphim stand shaken. Your womb contains the brilliant rays that from a living flame shall waken this world whose sleep in sin-black night gives way before new life and light. The gardener who clears the thorns, a lion's cub whose jaws shall roar louder than all of Joshua's horns, and drive all craven wolves before. Such is the sun that all shall see, arise from you as from the sea. But who am I that you should come, bearing the one who made the world, who is its savior and its sum, and yet within you now lies curled? I am unfit, ancient of days, to welcome you or speak your praise. But lady blessed and full of grace, I see your beauty and rejoice, the radiant flush upon your face, a living water in your voice, disclosing what alone you know, that light and word within you grow. No angel spoke this truth to me, but he who dwells within me stirred, the moment that my eyes could see your distant form and my ears heard your call as down the hill you came, bearing that secret, ancient flame. I'll conclude with another somewhat similar poem. It's one of those poems that, I tend to, after I write a poem, the first person to see after it's halfway decent anyhow will be usually my wife. In fact, without exception, my wife. And this is one that she said, "Oh, it's nice. It's simple." I didn't think it was that simple. You can be the judge. By the way, I am just a simple man, a common traveling salesman, and so I do have, I think, 10 copies or 9 or 10 copies of my book. If anybody feels like buying one, they are available for $25. And if I had a pen, I'd be happy to sign it for you. But alas, there we go. pen present. So there we go. So this is a poem simply called "The Love of God." The love of God is earlier than man, present to us before we were to it. The love of God sustains and nourishes, and puts in being what had never been, save that it was first loved, and being loved had been at all. The love of God comes down and walks among his creatures as their friend, and dies among his children in their rage. The love of God has journeyed into hell, and all once closed is opened by that love. The love of God stands fearsome o'er our heads. The love of God has entered in our breasts, and there the love of God will dwell, where he was from the first the center of ourselves, for all things turn about the love of God. Thank you. So I know those poems were self-explanatory, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to. Oh, there's.
Can you go back to that poetry is a valid form of poetry, or like, are there like certain principles of poetry that makes it?
Slam poetry?
Do you think that's like a valid form, or are there like objective principles by which like poetry is considered poetry?
So that phenomenon, along with rap and like cowboy poetry, and let's just toss this in for good measure, Bob Dylan getting the Nobel Prize for Literature. All of these phenomena are signs that people understand that poetry is in some sense supposed to sing. It's supposed to be orderly speech that lends itself to rhythmical recitation. Not always singing in the sense of song, but also, the two great sources of the poetic are music on one hand, but also rhetoric, classical rhetoric. And it's the meeting of those two things that brought poetry in the ancient world with Homer and Horace, and in the modern world from Shakespeare to the present day into being. But beginning really only in the middle of the 20th century, there was a widespread abandonment of the basic techniques, rhyme and meter in particular, well, not in particular, rhyme and meter, by many poets, that led to poems becoming variously lineated kinds of prose. And so with that came a rapid decline in general interest in poetry for the most part. And so what I see with all of those phenomena is an effort to recover the performative, the musical, the incantatory, and the ritualistic aspects of poetry that are proper to the art. So insofar as they do that, they're valid. Poetry is performative. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. I'm sure you all have learned how to scan a line of pentameter verse at some point in your college career. But you can't scan, what is that smile? Is that you haven't? You have? Not you. The
Smile is.
Yeah, oh, okay, good, yeah, okay. Not the smile of I stayed in bed that day. Consider if you're reading a Shakespeare sonnet silently to yourself. The only reason you can scan it is because in the silence of your mind, you can still hear it voicing itself. If somehow text were ever to be separated from speech, and it's a big somehow, that's not actually possible. But if somehow text were to be separated from speech, it would be impossible to say whether a line of verse scanned or did not, because the stresses are dependent upon how the word printed is sounded when spoken. Or maybe we should just say that the text is always dependent on speech. So writing in verse, in meter and rhyme, is a perpetual reminder of the non-negotiable intrinsic connection between the words we read and the words we recite. When there was, I think, a lot of modern poetry tried to sunder that intrinsic relationship. And even when it was often in the name of improving performance, that meter was somehow too stiff and we want to sound more familiar, or contemporary, or colloquial. I think oftentimes the effect was simply to make poems things that lay inertly on the page to be read with the eye and no longer to be heard with the ear, whether it's the ear of the mind or the ear of the body. So all of those modes of poetry are trying to reconnect the performative and the meditative, the reading and the reciting. And insofar as they do that, I think that that's great. There's an even better path, though, a nobler path, and that's simply to write in the meter that our ancestors gave us. And that's what I've tried to do. I chose the better path. Yeah.
So T.S. Eliot said that Dante and Shakespeare divide the modern world.
Mhm.
There is no third,
Mhm.
at least as of right now, there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Do you view Shakespeare as a Catholic poet in any way?
I do. Yeah. Boy, you all are so well prepared because in the car driving here today, I recited just that passage from Eliot, and the driver Joe was I know that. So I do. I just had it. I think the way I would probably put it is that Shakespeare is most plausibly a Catholic poet, but not fully so, because he lacks what George Santayana, the Catholic atheist of Harvard, once said, called the cosmic dimension. Do you know Santayana?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Santayana said Shakespeare in a very provocatively titled essay. It's really quite wonderful, called "The Absence of Religion in Shakespeare." Santayana complains that Shakespeare has no interest in the cosmos, and I think his insight is basically just what evidence do we need? We need only to turn to that other poet, Dante, and look at the Divine Comedy and say, what does the world look like from Dante's eyes? What does the world look like from Shakespeare's? On one, we have the heavenly hierarchy, and even the most damned souls are perfectly orderly in their sitting. What does the world look like from Shakespeare's eyes? It's an old man naked and covered in mud on a heath screaming, howl, howl, howl. But is Shakespeare a Catholic poet? Yes, because in response to that howl comes this Christ figure of Cordelia, who drops in as if by helicopter and what do you call the line that drops off the helicopter? The army men use. G.I. Joe figures use, whatever. She to change the metaphor, but just make it a little more convenient. She parachutes in, late in the play, and she says, I have come to go about my Father's business, reciting the words of Christ to identify what she's doing there. So Christ erupts in the world, grace erupts in the world and saves it from despair and nihilism in Shakespeare. But the world is still a place so broken in Shakespeare that grace can only appear in these brief moments. And when Cordelia appears, of course, she finally dies. But of course, if she's a Christ figure, that's just what you would expect. So the difference is not between Shakespeare and Dante is not whether they're Christian, but it's whether Shakespeare can envision the world as one ordered by God's providence. And in a sense, I think he does, but it's ordered by, you might say, God's providence at the last possible moment. Right? Whereas the depiction of the soul that Dante gives us in the middle cantos of the Purgatorio is every bit an image of a world as wayward and chaotic as what Shakespeare gives us. But for Dante, it's set right in the middle where we can see it. It's prominent, but it's not the true vision of things. It's the despair and the confusion, the disorder of a world without, the emperor that Dante thinks God wants for us is still. It may be a place of confusion, but you can still see the orderliness of things circumscribing it and penetrating it. So that's the big difference. That lends itself to an argument that would say something like, well, Shakespeare's a good Calvinist rather than a Catholic, and I think that's true. There's something. That's plausible. There's something to be said for that. But we all know he's Catholic. So. Yeah.
Just following up on the earlier question. So I guess I was not entirely understanding what you're saying, but do you think you're saying the higher path is to just use the meter and verse that our ancestors gave us. Were you
Yeah.
thinking of that in the sense that they perfected the art of poetry, or merely that that's the best type, but it can be improved?
So in every poetic tradition, this is perhaps risking overgeneralization, but I think it's better to just risk that than to be unclear. In every linguistic tradition, the poetic form that emerges comes by taking the most conspicuous feature of the morphology of the shape of the language and simply bringing it to measure. Okay, so in Greek and Latin, we have the long and the short syllables. In England, we have this semi-regular alteration of stress. We're always altering stress. We're always going up and down. All that meter does is simply take this natural property and further order it so that it becomes, wind in the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past, or batter my heart, three-person God for you as yet, but not breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, or throw me and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. That's just what you do speaking, but slightly more orderly. A naked person and a person wearing clothes are both people, but the one who wears clothing is civilized. This is just the civilizing of the native properties of our language. Not, mind you, don't try to take that metaphor too far, as Sir Philip Sidney does in The Defense of Poetry, where he refers to meter as the garment, ornament, and apparel of poetry. I didn't mean that at all. If that was the possible implication, that I would not have used that analogy. It's simply a refinement of what's already there, refinement of nature. So the conundrum then becomes, what are the appropriate techniques for meter? And there really can only be one in English, because it's rooted in the properties of the language, not in arbitrary choices of, we're going to count syllables, we're going to count accents, we'll count both together. That gradual process emerges out of poets attending to the native properties of our speech. And then the whole history and prosody of the practice of versecraft emerges further out of figuring out what works and what doesn't. And so in one sense, English verse was perfected in the 16th century. And that is, the poets figured out what were the variations in meter that work well to make the line a suitable and capacious medium for speech without it frequently losing its rhythmic qualities. Right? So I don't want to go on too long about this, but since most of you will have at least some prosody, the first foot, a trochee in the first foot, trochee in the middle of the line after a pause, a feminine ending, to be or not to be, that is the question. All of that quickly gets accepted as fine because it doesn't interrupt our hearing of verse as a medium. So in that sense, things got figured out and perfected pretty early. We're talking about 2 generations, from Sir Philip Sidney publishing writing his sonnets, to the last plays of Shakespeare, where you see the capaciousness of verse stretched to its limit by using enjambment and having grammar be set at variance with the length of the line. That's pretty much, in a certain sense, that's the perfection and the end of the development of English poetic technique. But that's just talking about versification. Poets have continuously developed new ways of speaking within the confines of that form ever since, which is why, just to give a quick example, I love the fact that in English poetry, you can say, to be or not to be, that is the question. So august and profound. And in the exact same meter, and even with the exact same grammatical inflections, you can say, the toilet's clogged again. Please call the plumber. It's all iambic pentameter. If you can talk about plumbing and the profound mysteries of the universe all in the same meter, you can do anything in that meter. But that doesn't mean English poetry stays the same, that arts don't move towards the ideal. Arts are about proliferation. You read one poem and you want to read another. You might read the greatest book ever written, and you would never say, that's the ideal book. We're done now, right? We can just stop reading books. We read the one, you know? No, you would always want another. And you would actually gladly, most of us anyhow, would gladly take as a gift an inferior book. Just because of its difference, it will give you a new sort of avenue to encounter being, encounter existence. And so that's why you could, in principle, have a perfection of the basic techniques of the art, but still have this continuous, restless change, not to say necessarily growth in the modes of expression in poetry. Yeah.
I was just wondering, at the beginning of this, you mentioned the inspiration behind this writing of this book.
Mhm.
Was about two things: the richness of life
Mhm.
and brutality
Mhm.
of things.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering, with your intention going into the book, was it to highlight some sort of intermingling relationship between those two, or was it rather to see their opposition?
It was to, I think it was rather to see through one to the other. And that's, I must admit, so I mentioned at the outset that this was originally supposed to be my next book of poems, at which point that would have meant my third book of poems. And I was almost done with this, but I knew there were a few poems I still needed to write. I needed to write the Cicero poem, needed to write a poem about Maria Monk. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but interesting thing I won't go into right now. But and then also a final poem that drew all of this into a whole. So I still had those 3 poems to work on. Otherwise, this book was done. And I was already looking ahead to the next book of poems. And I had written some poems for it. And I'd even hit upon the poem that I wanted to be the main poem of the book, one that's called Through the Water, but has as one of its lines in the middle of it, the strangeness of the good. And I thought, that's the next book, Strangeness of the Good. And that title and that poem and that book as a whole ends up actually having rather overlapping themes with this one, in the sense of seeing through the spectacle of evil into the basic goodness of being that God proclaims. So in that book, what ended up being The Strangeness of the Good, I had some short poems started, and I was on the path to gradually working on that book. But then I know some of you may have missed this, but in 2020 there was this pandemic, and 2 things intertwined. One is on March 15th of 2020, I found myself in my study just wanting to write a few lines about what was happening in the news. And at that same time, I had in my head, and had for some time, the thought of what it would look like to take the blank verse of Shakespeare and step back a ways from the heavy enjambment that he uses in his late plays and that we find in Milton's Paradise Lost, where 16 lines form a sentence, and if you stop at the end of the line, you're going to miss, the heavily enjambed. They require you to roll over the end of the line. I wanted to see what if we could give the iambic pentameter line back some of its integrity. So I was just writing these little lines about what was going on in what turned out to be the early days of the pandemic. And a poem kind of came out. And I thought, this is kind of interesting. And the next day or a couple days later, I wrote another one. And I just had the dates of their composition at the top. And I thought, I think I could do a lot of these. I think I'd like to kind of write the news in pentameter. And so the magazine Dappled Things, which is primarily a print magazine but has a web page, I contacted the publisher of the magazine. I said, would you be interested in doing the news of the pandemic in verse? And he said, would I? I mean, that's, what it was, that's just how publishers are, right? Boy, oh boy, I can't wait. Yeah. So anyhow, so suddenly I found myself writing and publishing 2 poems a week, the way a newspaper reporter does, where I was writing about what was in the news, but also what was going on at home, and just what the experience was like in those first few months of the pandemic. I ended up writing 15 poems total, and two a week appeared until the last one, which was an epilogue. And when that was done, those created a bit of a stir's the wrong word. What would be the word? A more than indifferent response. And so my publisher, with whom I'd done my previous book, got excited. He said, "I want to bring this out into print. These poems." And I thought, well, that kind of makes sense, because this quarantine notebook, as the long poem came to be called, is almost a book-length poem, and it really is, the theme of the poem is the strangeness of the good. That is to say, the way in which within the pandemic, there were kind of strange, weird little blessings to be found, though they were hardly the main theme of the poem. And so I said, this is the second half of the strangeness of the good, which meant suddenly that the strangeness of the good was basically done, and this poem still needed 3 bloody poems. So I published that in 2020, and then this one 4 years later, 2024. And in that one, that first book, The Strangeness of the Good, I really think it's looking through the appearance of evil, but also looking through superficial sentimental accounts of goodness and trying to get at ontological goodness, that is to say, the goodness of being. This one, I wanted more to focus on the peculiarly modern atrocities, like there's one poem about the Dresden bombing, Waking in Dresden, in here, but then to also contemplate and respect and honor the response to the Second World War and to the Dresden bombing and to the atrocities of the Holocaust, etc., that was made by what in my view is the greatest generation of American poets, which are the poets who began writing around 1945, when many of them came home from the Second World War, and ended in about 1965, when, to put it crudely, the hippies ruined everything. For 20 years, you have virtually every talented poet in America writing finely constructed metrical and rhymed verse. Almost every poet. And the greatest of that generation never quit. So you may know the poet Richard Wilbur, who lived not too far from here until he was 95 years old. And then Anthony Hecht, who died just a few years before him. They were, in my view, the 2 greatest poets of the second half of the 20th century, greatest American poets. But there are also other poets who started off with the same attention to form and brilliant construction that we find in Richard Wilbur and Anthony Hecht, who later kind of abandoned ship. The most famous example would be the poet Robert Lowell, who begins writing these tautly metaphysical lyrics in the early 40s, right after he converted to Catholicism. And he keeps doing it until, and I really think this is the whole reason he switched, he began to fear that the beatniks were going to be more popular than he was. And so he decided, not out of any sincere conviction, but just in order to maintain his status as America's leading poet, to loosen his style and to imitate the free verse of the beatniks in some ways. So anyhow, so this book, I need to bring this to a conclusion. So this book was actually shaped as a kind of homage to that generation of American poets. And it's structured in such a way, in terms of the order of the poems, in different ways to celebrate their work and honor their work. And I have each section has epigraphs from the poets of those generations, or that generation, just to remind us of their achievement. But the main thing that I was trying to get to, and I'm struggling to, is this: that what those poets did was they saw the worst of temporal evil, and they came home, and instead of despairing, said, "Thank the Lord, the war is over." They went to college and tried to learn something, and then they tried to make beautiful things that reckoned with evil, but also took consciousness and it took into account the possibilities of the true and the good and the beautiful. So this book is structured around, you might say, the form of their lives. Is that it?
I have one more question.
Really?
Yeah.
I was going to say people are afraid to ask another question for fear of the answer.
I guess I was going to ask whether you think that poetry is more important or more tangible to older people than the youth, because the youth has like less capacity for leisure because they're more active, or and also less memories. They're more like motivated by imagination, or whether poetry kind of appeals to both memory and imagination. Kind of.
So at the end of that poem, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, there's this line, the myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth. Now, as somebody who spent 13 years trying to interest 18 and 19-year-olds in Plato and Aristotle, I'm not having the Aristotle's various comments in the ethics that there's no point even talking about ethics with these young people. You know, it's philosophies for the old. But I actually find that thought kind of sentimentally appealing. You know, that I remember a newspaper article from 20 or 30 years ago that described the difference between when the French retire and when Americans retire. This was right when my first uncles were starting to retire. What did my Uncle Jack do when he retired after 30 years as a vice president at Kodak? Well, he goes and, of course, goes to a Sun City in the Southwest so he can golf all the time. But then he also gets a part-time job as a groundskeeper. Just, you got to keep busy. Whereas I remember in the newspaper article, there was some old woman who no doubt was sitting on a turned over bucket outside a store in some rural small village in France. And they said, what do you want to do with your retirement? And the French woman said, to reflect. So there's certainly some truth that at least some of us grow more reflective, more attentive, and more patient with age. And the next poem in this book is a poem called The Wisdom of Old Men, which is about the old men who would sit by the kettle drum fireplace at the deer camp I would go to every year up north, and just how they were a vision of attention, reflection, and leisure that you're describing. But as a homeschooled boy I was talking to years ago said, you're never too young to read Plato. And if you're not too young to read Plato, then you're never, you can be too young to read Plato, especially the symposium features. But try bringing that into a middle school. Okay, so, you're almost never too young to read Plato. And it's, it's got to be that this is one of the revelations of Christianity, that we were born to know God, and not just know him most perfectly in our life in heaven, but there should at all times be foretastes of that in our life. And that's why I think, children love stories. Aristotle says at the beginning of the Metaphysics that poetry too is full of wonders and therefore in a certain sense philosophical. And why so much of the intellectual life starts with stories is because even at the earliest age, we are called to reflection and contemplation. It's easier when we're young little barbarians to do it while thinking about stories. But then we never outgrow stories. But it's always the case that we never outgrow stories. But it's also the case that we're never too young to enter into the contemplation towards which stories lead us. Does that make sense? That wasn't just evasive answer trying to save my work as a professor. Okay. Well, thanks.
Yeah, please join me in thanking Dr. Wilson.